Hi, everybody. I think we're live. It's great to be here. My name is Martin Whitaker. I'm the CEO of Just Capital. With me is my colleague and Chief Strategy Officer, Allison Omans. And we're going to have a fireside chat, even though it's about 85 degrees outside in New York City, with two incredible women about women and diversity in the workforce, of course, Case and Mellody Hobson. And we're going to be having what I hope will be just a very informal conversation where we get to grips with some of the key issues today in that area. Both Jean and Mellody really need very little to no introduction. They are rock stars in our world, and we're just really privileged and humbled that you're here with us today and willing to participate in this, and really to try and, I think, explore what are some crucial issues at play today in America. Jean is chair of National Geographic. She's the CEO of Case Impact Network. She is an author. She holds many other positions, boards, and advisory roles, and has been a great friend to Just for a long time. And it's great to be with you, Jean. And
great to be here. Thanks, Martin.
Mellody is co-CEO and president of Ariel Investments, who she joined many years ago as an intern. I've just had it confirmed, which we're interested to get that story. Mellody is chair of the board of Starbucks and director of JP Morgan, and is involved with many, many other organizations. And really, I would say is an absolute leading voice now, certainly in this country, if not internationally, on women in the workplace, and especially women of color and their experience in the workplace. And we're going to be exploring those because they're both key topics of relevance to Just Capital's mission of building a more just and inclusive economy. So maybe, Allison, can I just turn to you? Do you want to set the stage a little bit and add any other comments and color to what I've just said?
Sure. Thanks, Martin. And let me just echo with my thanks both for Mellody and Jean, as well as everyone for joining. It's a delight to be sharing a virtual stage with you. So just to start by saying that we know that the last year and a half has devastated women's participation in the American workforce. We saw 2.2 million people, women, exiting the labor market in the first 9 months of the pandemic. And while recent job numbers are showing signs of recovery, women and people of color are missing from the recent growth on both jobs and wages. And so the conversation that we want to have today is, how do we create a workforce that is more equitable in terms of the recovery, as well as equitable and inclusive in the long term? And so we want to start today by just sort of asking, where do we go from here? One of the numbers that always sticks with me as we have this conversation, that I feel like we were talking a lot about a year ago, and I've heard it less recently, but I think is really critical, is that it took, after the Great Recession, it took until 2018 to see the same levels of representation from Black women prior to 2008. So it basically took 10 years to get back to that place, which I think all of us will agree is unacceptable, to see that level of growth again coming out of this period of time. So let me just start by asking, what is it going to take to get women back into the workforce, and how do we create a more inclusive recovery?
Mellody, why don't you kick us off?
Okay, I'm happy to do so and share the stage with my dear, dear, dear friend who inspires me, Jean Case. What will we need to do? So this is a very hard question with a multifaceted answer that I will try to, get to the essence of. The first thing that I think is really important is intentionality. We have to be super intentional, and we have to set real goals. It's interesting to me that when we talk about things related to race or gender, suddenly in corporate America, things get really fuzzy. We don't necessarily have targets because people associate targets with quotas, and they are very different. And we don't have the same accountability that we have in like everything else we do in corporate America. That accountability where we incent the behavior that we want. I've talked about this many times. You get what you incent in corporate America. And corporate America has done a really good job of figuring that out, incenting the behavior that they want around performance. I work in the asset management industry, around sales. We could go on and on about how all that's very, very clear. You don't walk into those jobs not knowing, and you certainly don't run those areas without a great deal of accountability. We need that same intentionality. We need those same kind of incentives, and we need that same level of accountability when it comes to race and gender. One more point, and we can talk about what all of that means in terms of metrics and the like. But one more point, it can't be a zero-sum game. That is something that I really worry about. When we talk about gender issues, it's at the expense of race. And people think that if they're solving for gender, they've done that, that they're focused on diversity. It should be an and proposition, not an or proposition. And you don't get to pat yourself on the back if you feel like you've been intentional in one area and not both, because diversity is not siloed by gender or race. Diversity is truly being inclusive. So I will stop there. I know I spoke in generalities because it's such a big question, and I'm happy to hand it over to Jean, and I can get more specific with time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's spot on, Melody. And probably the only thing I would add to that is that same intentionality that's so necessary that, as Melody points out, we bring to all other aspects of managing and running our businesses needs to be brought here. Measurement does. But the other piece I think is really critical is transparency, because I think without transparency around what the corporate activities are, it's too easy to make broad statements to be qualitative and not quantitative. And here I think we really do need to be quantitative and measure progress and how we're doing against our goals. It needs to be a conversation in the boardroom. It needs to be a conversation among stakeholders, including things like even in the supply chain. So I think that, that transparency piece will help keep folks honest when, the progress isn't just necessarily there, and hopefully will light a continuing fire.
Let's just drill down a little bit on that, because I think you set the stage perfectly. Mellody, what do you see today as some of the key barriers to that? Because it doesn't seem to us, as we're tracking companies on all this stuff, that this is really rocket science. In many ways, this is not beyond, the imagination of business to be able to figure out. So what do you see as some of the key barriers? Are they sort of practical, operational? Are they cognitive? Do some people just not get it? You talked about the zero-sum game. Like, are people just not making the mental connections on these issues that they need to? Where do you see the biggest barriers and challenges?
I see a disconnect between saying and doing. I think people talk a really good game around these issues and talk around the ideals of diversity and inclusion. We read annual reports for a living at Ariel, and you can read pages and pages in public company documents about the dedication to diversity and inclusion. And I've often asked CEOs, then reconcile that with, for me, what you've said on these pages with when I turn to the back of your annual report and I look at the leadership of the company and I see an absence of that kind of diversity. So it doesn't make any sense. And I think we have to hold people accountable to their words. And I don't think we have to do that being caustic or belligerent, but I think we need to be super honest and authentic about it. That kind of simple question as an investor really puts someone, it brings the subject to head. We have to recognize, just at Ariel as an investment firm that has almost $17 billion under management, that we can use our power for good just with questions. You don't have to go and threaten someone. You can just, when you're a very large shareholder, people want to make sure you're happy. And so those kind of questions can lead to very, very good outcomes. The other thing that I would say that becomes a barrier, certainly some of it is cognitive. I mean, we still have 100 plus Fortune 500 companies that don't have a Black person on their board. That's kind of a head scratcher in 2021 for me. Like, that just seems so obvious. That's like the lowest hanging fruit that could possibly exist to demonstrate your commitment to these issues. So if you're missing on that, there's obviously some cognitive dissonance there. But then let's move forward and say, then what does move the needle? Leadership. The board is the boss. They're the boss of the CEO. And at the end of the day, that board, if you truly are a believer in diversity, it has to reflect the society that we live in if you truly want to be a 21st century company. And then, of course, I would love, and I think it's very important that the C-suite start to have that same reflection. And then as you move down the organization to the rank and file, what people often do, and this is a barrier, they go and measure their diversity. I've seen this so many times, I can't even tell you. They roll everyone up into a multicultural umbrella. So they have diverse, they're multicultural people. They even throw women in there. And I'm like, in doing that, you mask underrepresentation. So if you want to really understand the diversity of your organization, you must look at diversity by ethnicity and by gender. And so that you can truly understand, what are you working with and where are your shortfalls? And then where's the target? The target is just based on the demographics of our society. You are not allowed, and this is one of the other famous things that people do. They'll talk about their available diversity in their community. They'll say, well, in our community, it's only 2% diverse, and we have 2% Black people. And I say, I know a lot of Black people who would move for a good job. So that just doesn't work for me in terms of logic. So these are the kind of things where we truly have to hold ourselves accountable from beginning to end.
Jean, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, and I think, there's a couple of ways you can come at this. One is, look, this is just right. It's just the right thing to do. But I think the best news is the overwhelming and compelling data, and Just has done a lot of this work too, that's making it very clear that companies with diverse teams on the board and in the C-suite outperform. They outperform financially in terms of profits and share performance, but we're also finding that their cultures are more innovative and that the employee happiness is greater. I mean, we're kind of going right down the line of things every CEO or board member should be really concerned about. And we're finding that the answer lies in having a diverse team. So, sometimes I think when people hear us talking about this, they think, oh, that's just that social good stuff. And we do hear, we even hear great leaders in finance say some of these things, but I just don't think you can get too caught up in worrying about that as much as worrying about the performance of the business. And they see a disconnect and they're blind or not listening to the data that is really overwhelming and compelling these days on that front.
That is 100% true. There's so much math around this. There's data on when you have one diverse person, when you have more than one, when you have three. I mean, literally, you can see a direct correlation to the success of the business over the long term.
And how are you both feeling about this moment? Like, obviously, the last year and a half, both with the pandemic and the racial reckonings we've been going through, do sort of feel, in addition to all the research that we've been spending years developing on the points of why diversity does help business, are you feeling optimistic? Are you seeing, Mellody, you were talking about your engagement with companies and saying, like, seriously, in this day and age, like, do you feel like we are entering this new phase, or are you feeling like the accountability, like it's time to be asking even more questions, or there's more that's required in this next phase? What's the temperature check for you both?
Do you want to go?
Sure. Well, I think that there are probably a couple of different classes of companies out there in terms of, what we would say about how real this moment is for them. I think there is a great collaboration of corporations that, for instance, have said, hey, we're totally ready to take our EEOC data and make it public. They're really trying to fire on pistons, do some really deep listening and understand with intentionality and measurement where they need to be. And then there's still a huge swath of the market that I think, is maybe talking the talk, but we're not seeing walking the walk or the progress that we really need to see to get to where we need to be.
Yeah, we've seen the EO1 numbers basically double in the last 2 years among the 100 largest that we're tracking. So that is an interesting proof point. Mellody?
What I would say is I go up and down on this, and I wish I could have a clean, precise answer for you. There are moments where I take great joy in the progress that I think we're making. I see breakthroughs like Roz Brewer becoming the CEO of Walgreens Boots Alliance, or Tasunda Duckett becoming the CEO of TIA, 2 Black women running Fortune 500 companies. My own leadership at Starbucks. I was not the first Black woman to chair a company. Ursula Burns was, but being there. So all of that gives you moments, and then you put that moment in perspective, and it's like devastating. Yeah. And I'm like, there have been 2 chairmen of Fortune 500 companies in the history of the stock market. Like, I think I'm talented and smart and work really hard, but I'm not the smartest that ever was. There are others. And so you put that in perspective and you're like, that's not right. And I don't want us getting excited about, we're stepping over such low bars. Now, that wasn't a low bar to achieve. I don't want to make it sound that way. But in terms of, we can't feel like this is tremendous progress because suddenly there are 3 Black women that have, risen to some ranks in corporate America that we hadn't seen before. Tremendous breakthrough on the one hand. On the other hand, definitely not good enough. So I want to say that with, again, so much humility, because I just want to demand more of our society. And I don't think that's a big ask. When you think of all of the opportunity that exists, all of the possibility that exists in this country, I would like more people to be able to participate. And I know that's the whole point of Just Capital. And so, my optimism is never ending, because that's the person that I was born to be. I'm always the sunny side. The glass is half full. I believe in hope. I love that Barack Obama quote, there's never been anything false about hope. But the flip side of it, and where I think I have to be very honest, accountable, authentic, and push, this is not good enough.
I love that point. And by the way, that's just better economics. More people participating, more people feeling like they can bring what they got to the market is better all around. So, I think that sometimes gets forgotten as well in this zero-sum game. It's sort of like, okay, well, we're now, like, it's like I win, you lose all the time. I want to come back to this sort of journey that businesses are on, because that's one of the things that Just does. We're tracking companies all the time on this stuff. I think one thing that we've seen, which is not immediately obvious, is that companies tend to be very reticent to come out unless the story's really good. Right? They don't want to come out with something that's sort of like, in progress, because the criticism will be very intense. And I think most companies would say, let's just do things privately first before we start to be transparent about that. So until we got a good story to tell. Not all companies, and there are some great examples of firms like PayPal, who we know very well, doing things publicly in the public domain, where it's not a great story initially, but the whole point is they're getting better. What do you think about that? Do you like, is that do business leaders need more courage? Do they need a little bit more of an incentive? Jean, what's your take on that?
Well, I think it's a really good point. And for any of us who've been watching the Olympics, they're using this term, which you use a lot in fitness, which is progress, not perfection, right? And the idea is you start right where you are and you try to get better. So I think what Mellody was referencing at the beginning of this conversation is just being crystal clear about where you want to get, but also being super real about, what it's going to take to get there, and that action, really being committed to. But Martin, I totally share your view on this. The CEOs that I know that don't feel like their data is good enough, whether that data is on climate, whether that data is on, you name it, any of the factors that folks are looking at today and judging companies by, there's like a reluctance to be transparent about it unless they already look good. And I think that's something that we have to, really work on. But the other thing I just wanted to say is, following up on Mellody's last point, Martin, we've talked a lot, about stakeholder capitalism and the need really to revisit how capitalism is working for Americans. And I think, fundamentally, if we get this right, capitalism is going to work for more people in more places. And that is really good for everyone. It's good for our economic strength as a nation, but it also can protect the very core of what's made us great as a nation. Because as we've discussed, there are some generations behind us that are questioning the fundamentals of our economic system that brought us here, basically. And I think this opportunity to have an honest conversation and a willingness to accept that companies aren't perfect, but they're trying to make progress is how we're going to get from here to there. But it's tough. And I think CEOs have a little fear around that that's understandable.
I think there's another piece to this. I agree 100% with what Jean says. We often do. But the other piece of it, I think there are two other pieces. I think one is that CEOs are afraid of lawyers. And I think lawyers say to them, you're going to get sued.
We're all afraid of lawyers. We're all afraid of lawyers.
You're going to get sued over this, even at times when it's just super logical. So it's, it's like, what is the downside of opening up this can of worms around this admission of this shortfall? And I can imagine the room of the people sitting around the table vetting the issue, saying downside, not lots of upside, lots of downside here. Mm-hmm. And this will just expose us in some way. And so it's not crazy. We live in a very litigious society. And so I understand maybe where people say, I'm a little reticent to put myself out there because of potential, again, legal exposure. I think the other piece of it is that vulnerability and frailty in our society are looked down upon. I mean, that's just a fact. And it's just super, super sad. And hopefully we have a society where that changes. We're all supposed to be invincible. We're all, supposed to be perfect in so many ways. We all know that is impossible. That is not true. I was having breakfast with my husband today, and we were talking about something, and it was related to just discipline and commitment, etc. And my husband, who's, a brilliant person in his own right, he looked at me and he says, well, you're special forces. It doesn't count. And I looked back at him and I was like, well, that's a new term, but he's like, but you are. And I was like, but I'm not. And it's that idea that, we have this invincibility or this perfection that then makes someone very, very reticent to admit that they can't do something or pull it off, or they failed at something. Here's where I give a lot of credit to Jamie Dimon. Jamie Dimon is as straight a shooter as you're ever going to meet. And when he was unhappy with their numbers around the advancements of African Americans inside of the bank, particularly, he pointed out Black men, he called it out for the whole company and started putting stakes in the ground all over the place. I joined the board right when that was happening. And I have to say to him, he was very bold, because I wasn't used to people saying, this is not good enough. The numbers do not lie. I am not happy with this outcome. And we are going to change this. And it wasn't going to happen in 10 minutes, but at least there was the same sense of urgency there that he puts on the success of the rest of the business. And I've seen that firsthand, not overstating, not time for any victory laps, but saying, being willingness to admit a problem.
Yeah, so Mellody, that's all really great stuff, but I still agree with George. You are special forces, and we'll just leave it at that.
I don't know, but I think that becomes problematic. I mean, look at our amazing Simone Biles.
Yeah.
I mean, that becomes problematic. And so then the strength and brilliance and inspiration of her is that she admitted the frailty.
Yeah.
That will be more significant than anything she has ever done to me.
Right.
And that is where literally I am inspired beyond anything I've ever been, because I'm like, that took more courage than doing a bad vault.
Right. And I think particularly, the groups that we're talking about, whether they be women or people of color, any underrepresented group, has double problem with showing that vulnerability and doesn't necessarily feel a safe table to even put it out there. Right.
No.
And I think that one thing I've really learned in the last year and a half is this whole idea of inclusion, because you can have the numbers, right? You can check all the boxes, but if at the end of the day, who someone is and what they bring to the party, they don't feel they can live out in their environment, then that's not inclusion. And I think that sort of addition of a focus on how do we truly make it something where people feel a sense of belonging and a comfort to bring their challenges and the opportunities forward, where, you know, the data can be there, but it can be not necessarily reflective of the culture.
So this conversation is really interesting to me because one of the things I sort of struggle or wonder about is the heart versus the brain of like the sort of bravery that you're talking about and just the sort of morality or consistency of Jamie Dimon just putting himself out there and saying, no, this is not enough, or Simone Biles or any other leader that we think about. And yet, Mellody, you were also starting and sort of referring to measurements and accountability and how do we actually measure both performance and movement on topics, but also that like je ne sais quoi of heart, of like commitment. And so I'd love to hear from you both, maybe starting with Mellody on like what measurements you are looking for sort of beyond demographics in your engagement strategy, but also like, how do you get at that, trying to understand which companies, which leaders are actually committed to advancing equity and which ones are just sort of like putting forth metrics that they know may tell a good story, may tell a bad story, but isn't really connected to the leadership of individual companies and people.
Wow, that's a really big question. And the way that I'm going to start this answer, and I'm very curious to hear how Jean will respond, is I'm going to start the answer with something that may sound very counterintuitive, which is, I don't think we need to go for heart. I'd love to have it. I personally, I think I'm left and right brain. I have heart and brain in what I do. I believe in servant leadership, and I've been at the feet of someone like Howard Schultz for over 15 years, talking about leading through the lens of humanity. I drank the Kool-Aid, or the coffee, as we would say. I really believe that makes companies more effective, having that heart piece. I remember reading something from Herb Kelleher, who founded Southwest Airlines, and he said, you motivate people in their souls and in their wallets. I don't know how to measure soul. I do know how to measure these other things. And I think that's where this gets very fuzzy and becomes unacceptable, because people want credit for intention as opposed to outcomes. That is problematic. And so they want you to literally, I've been in 100 conversations, if not 1,000, Jean has, Allison, you probably have, where people want you to be like, well, I'm a good guy.
Yeah.
And it's like, but it doesn't, nothing backs this up. Okay, you're a good guy, but the numbers don't reflect whatever it is that you think you are. So let's just go back to math. Let's go back to goals. Let's go back to measuring progress year by year. Let's go back to what Jean suggests, being transparent about it. Ken Frazier at Merck publishes all of his diversity data in painful detail. And he does it because he says he wants his people to know it's getting published. And when you have to actually be accountable for something that becomes public, I know this is such a small example. We've had a board meeting at Ariel for every year since the company was founded, every quarter. And I always tell people, the best thing about that is I never want to show up with nothing to show for what I've done. Like, you don't want to show up empty-handed in front of these smart, brilliant people. You certainly don't want to do that in your annual report or in a public document. And so if you know you have to work against publishing, transparency, etc., I think it leads you to actually get things done that are actually real. And you have to make sure you're not constantly moving the line. So I would love everyone to have heart. I would love people to, in their soul, believe everything that I believe, to know diversity is better, to know that they should look at any person, no matter who they are, no matter where they come from, and believe that they are as smart, as talented, as capable, has as many opportunities as they do as they sit there in that big seat. But I know that is not true. So I'm going to default to some basic math then to help move the cause along.
Yeah, you guys might have done a better job getting someone else here with Melody, because I'm in violent agreement with everything that she's saying. What I will add to that is I am utterly agnostic on heart versus brain. Agnostic, I don't care. I care about action. And what I will add to that is, in our work in movement building that we've done for decades, it is usually the ones that are doing this or the greatest cynics that when they come over in a really, really powerful way. So I think we need to be undaunted by those who don't necessarily bring the right heart or the right motivation. And as long as we're, really focused on continuing dialogue, right? Continuing engagement, but mostly this measurement and progress, whether that comes from the heart or whether that comes because, they fear their shareholders or whatever, just get it done. That is, at the end of the day, what I think is needed right now.
Can I add one more thing, which I think is important? The more you institutionalize this, the more you lessen the risk of it being tied to a person and their vision, and that person moving on and the whole thing being eroded when they've left the building. So to the extent that you can put it in the DNA, and so many companies have their values embedded in the DNA. Walmart still tells stories about Sam Walton and the fact that they were sharing rooms when they were on the road. I remember going to Walmart once and the person said to me, "Do you want a soda?" And I said, "Sure." So we go to the soda machine and she's like, "Our soda is 25 cents. I was like, it's in their, it's in their DNA. It's part of what they believe is this value piece. That value piece gets carried through to what they want to offer to their customers. So it is done all over the place in all sorts of organizations. I'm just saying, in order to get that to be institutionalized, and maybe they were looking at the expenses of the travel of their executives and all sorts of things at Walmart to make this a company-wide understood initiative. We have to do the exact same things when it comes to diversity and inclusion, or because Walmart is still focused on value, and Sam Walton died a long time ago, which shows the power of process as opposed to personality.
Yeah. So if you're going to institutionalize this, embed this into the DNA of the system, as opposed to have it be led by personalities, individual leaders, and about individual people, do you agree that you've got to have the incentives there? And if so, does the market currently value diversity sufficiently to create that incentive today?
I'm going to answer that super quickly. You're so right. So my new favorite line: diversity is not philanthropy. That's literally what people think you're talking about. I'm like, right. That's not what I'm talking about. Diversity is not philanthropy. And we have to stop that kind of mental exercise that people are doing, that they're this do-gooderism. We've got to go back to the practical. What is the direct outcome of having, what are the direct outcomes of having diversity? Those outcomes can be measured. They have been measured. And so I think we have to shift people's mental models when we have this conversation.
Yeah. And that's what I was trying to get at earlier with this cognitive thing, because I think there's so much misinformation and sort of misperception about what it is we're even talking about. You just framed it as an exercise in sort of mutual value creation, which is really what markets are all about. But if you think of this as just being woke or just being politically correct or being philanthropic, your entire framing of the issue is completely different. You don't see it in terms of value creation. I think this is part of the struggle that the entire sort of impact space has had in many ways, which is, wait, this is about philanthropy. This is about being good, being sort of not serious as an investor. And so I think we've got to try and get beyond that. And measurement and metrics and data is one way you get it. You get beyond it. Jean?
Well, I think one of the frustrating things I've seen is the very same consulting firms that CEOs rely on to guide them in strategic areas of their company. have come out with, as we said earlier in this conversation, an immense amount of data around the value, literally the economic value and the cultural, from a company competitiveness standpoint, value of diversity. But sometimes the very CEOs that will hire McKinsey or Deloitte will then ignore some of the data that's coming out in this space. So, I think it's a process. And I also think, we haven't talked about it, but this whole sort of unconscious bias training, I think has real value, because all of us have bias and we often aren't aware of what our biases are, right? And I think that's something that's become, a really important tool to use in the corporate environment to really, help people understand what they otherwise literally sometimes cannot see.
The other thing is, just to add to the point, which I completely agree with, if you asked any leader running any company, big or small, do you want a bigger market, a bigger customer base?
Exactly.
Everyone would say yes. I mean, no one says, no, I'd like to keep it small. And then the second thing is, if you said, do you want the best players? Everyone says yes. The question is, can you redefine their definition of what the best players are? Because if you come with, to Jean's point, a bias around what the best player looks like, what gender they are, where they come from, what school they went to, etc., all you're doing is narrowing the pool of people from which you can choose talent. Jesse Jackson has a quote that I really love. Baseball was not as good as it could be until Jackie Robinson could play. Until everyone could be on the field, you didn't know how good the game could be. That's the brilliance and beauty of sports. It's objective. The free throw line doesn't move every time LeBron gets to it versus a white player. And yet, unfortunately, and people, this is not a controversial statement. It moves all the time for Black people, brown people, people with different sexual orientations, women. The line moves, and the women on this call know it. And it's not always obvious, even to the most thoughtful, kind, the person leading with heart, is not always seen. I give the example all the time of, for years and years and years, and still even now, there are certain meetings that I'm in with my co-CEO, John Rogers, and people only make eye contact with him. No, I am not a shrinking violet, clearly. And I'm like, woo, over here. And it's like, it makes me crazy. I get so mad. And I remember once it was so bad, the person never looked at me in the meeting. I'm president of Ariel. And I walked out and I'm like spitting nails. And John looked at me, and I have to give him a lot of credit for this. And he was like, Mellody, they've never met anyone like you. You're going to have to give them a break. Like, you are a novelty in a way that they can't quite wrap their brain around you.
Yeah.
And that really, so then I said, all right, let's accept that. Then let's also point it out. Let's tell them. So I called the person who was traveling with that person, and I said, I just want you to know, did you notice this person never looked at me? And the person who was traveling with him, who was representing him, he was literally, I could see the equivalent of looking at his shoes on the phone, because it was that obvious. But we have to tell people.
Thank you for that story.
Yeah.
That requires such like a generosity and forgiveness, and also just like commitment to making things better. So
well, John helped me with it. I did say, with full disclosure, I wasn't being that big.
I'm not sure I would have either. I would have gotten it spitting mad, and then I do want to ask. This is such a great conversation, and we're getting a lot of questions too. So we do want to go to the audience. We've been Just Capital's been tracking racial equity across measurements that are publicly disclosed. We have a racial equity tracker, and we've been starting to pull out examples of both companies as well as, to a degree, individuals who are doing it well. And I do want to get a little bit to the practicality of like which companies or entrepreneurs, Jean, in your case, like things that you're seeing or people or practices that are that are doing it well. And Starbucks is one of the companies that comes to mind for us. But would love to just hear from you for folks who are thinking about like, yeah, but what is this, what playbook should I be following? What recommendations or thoughts do you have?
Yeah, I think storytelling is a really powerful way. Obviously, as chairman of the National Geographic Society, that's kind of our sweet spot. But what we've learned is storytelling is really powerful in terms of bringing people along on issues that, you want to influence them on. So I think what you guys do on that space, almost case study like, is really, really valuable. But I do think if you look at, and we haven't talked really specifically about just women in this conversation, but there's a lot to learn from corporate activities that have taken shape through the pandemic, specifically focused on women and their unique challenges, and they have had unique challenges. The bummer, Allison, you gave some data at the open, but the bummer is at the beginning of 2020, for the first time, women represented the majority of the workforce at 50.2%, I think it was. And of course, now, as we've said, we've fallen behind. But for savvy CEOs, and Mellody mentioned Merck, Fidelity is another one, the kind of things that they're doing, and I'll just mention a few things, are truly innovative. But what's interesting, we shouldn't have to call it innovative, but in our, in where we stand today, it is innovative against some of their peers. But it really results from what I referred to earlier as deep listening, a real understanding and asking the questions of what do you need from different segments. And I think they learned very clearly from women what they need. So for instance, in the case of Merck, they're really committed to increasing their female workforce, particularly recognizing how the workforce has dropped off. And they have something, that they are basically call it a re-internship. And the idea is bring women back who've left the workforce, put them through a period of time of training. But it is a great example of intentionality, going to where they want to see results, and then building up training and skill levels so that then they're brought into these full-time positions. Fidelity did like a concierge service over the last year. So on childcare, because as you know, support systems for women just dried up during the pandemic. Schools closed, daycare, their nannies didn't come over, the babysitters weren't available. And so Fidelity, for its workforce, said, we'll do the heavy lifting for you. We'll find the nannies, we'll do, the home improvement. So you can spend time both on your job primarily, and then have that time with your kids when you need it. So I think we're seeing companies waking up to what does it mean to support uniquely segments during this unique time.
And I've talked about measurements, and we call it the 3 Ps: people, purchasing, and philanthropy. We think those are the 3 drivers of change inside of corporate America. Starting with people, we want to measure across all strata of the business the diversity of the organization by ethnicity, from the C-suite and board all the way down to the rank and file. You don't get to pat yourself on the back by having 90% of your women be assistants. You need to see how that staggers up, that phases up throughout the organization, which is why, again, numbers cannot be rolled together. They must be compartmentalized. The second P we talk about is purchasing. We think the whole idea of supplier diversity is a last century term, and we like the idea of business diversity. Corporate spend creates a tremendous opportunity to affect meaningful change in the society by including minority businesses in the spend of the company. So companies can, by virtue of what they need to buy to exist, actually lift up Black, brown communities, women, business owners, in a way that I don't think they truly understand the possibilities that are there. Some organizations have done that very well. McDonald's is one that has had a history of really elevating Black, brown, and women entrepreneurs with their corporate spend. And then lastly, philanthropy, which I think lately has been the tail wagging the dog. I think there's been a lot of virtue signaling around philanthropic donations, especially last summer in the wake of George Floyd's death. But I think that does still represent a powerful channel as long as there's a long-term commitment to, again, issues of gender and race, and not the CEO's pet, idea and the like, where you're equitable in how you think about the philanthropic spend of the corporation. There are also some tactical things I think are brilliant. I love the idea of reverse mentorship And so when you think about, people are always talking about how they want to mentor women, how they want to mentor minorities. And I'm like, okay, that's great. Have them mentor you. You know, so it's a two-way street, because you need as much mentoring around these issues of gender and race as they may need around business skills and understanding you know, of certain things. And to look at it that way does say that, again, is inclusion. It's participatory. It's a two-way street. It's not a one-way street. And I say that to people all the time. They'll talk to me about their internship programs for women and minorities. And I said, make it a reverse program. One time they come and you're mentoring them. The other time that person is coming and mentoring you. Last thing, I think what the 30% Club did with Helena Morrison in the UK was really powerful. They put a stake in the ground. 30% of the board seats would be women. But when you tell, I read about Helena Morrissey in the New York Times and called her just, you know, blind and said, I'm going to be in London. Can I come and see you? And I went to see her because I said, I want to know how this worked. How did you get this done so fast? They're there for a whole country in less than a decade. And she said, I went to the most important men in the UK and I told them, this isn't going to be my project. It's yours. She said, I learned to have them advocate for women. And in that way, it wasn't the women having to go and try to advocate for themselves. I thought that was brilliant. She gave them the responsibility and the job. And then as they started to make progress, they had swagger and they were proud of it. And I thought that was really great. She was like, I don't want to be here fighting for this opportunity. I am making this your problem. And they took up the mantle.
Yeah. I think that there's so much truth to that. And I think the reverse mentoring point, genius. And you mentioned business diversity. We've seen that in our polling. I think it was, Allison, correct me if I'm wrong, number 2 or 3 issue when we oversample Black and brown Americans. What can business do to be more just? Post George Floyd, that was the number 2 issue. I think number 1 was pay a fair and livable wage. I want to come back to this carrot and stick, because sort of incentivizing action seems to be a recurring theme here. How should goals around women in the workplace and people of color in the workplace and diversity be tied to compensation? Are you seeing that more and more? You're on boards. You're both on boards of companies. Do you see that being a factor in executive comp?
Yes, we have that now both at Starbucks and JP Morgan, and it flows through the executive leadership team. And it's not, you know, the thing is, I think that people have really been getting more refined in how they're tying pay to that performance and where it's more meaningful. So I'm really pleased with the progress that is being made, but again, indicates to executives there is a stake in the ground. You know, the question for me always when I'm in these conversations, can you be a superstar in the company and have a completely non-diverse group of people that work with you? And if the answer is yes, then diversity is not a priority.
Yeah,
And
I'm
Jean,
seeing the same thing. Yeah, I'm seeing the same thing, Martin. And, you know, a little bit like that heart and brain question, you know, I think here you can be playing offense or you can be playing defense. And I think that what we're seeing is shareholder activism at a new level today, and actually success with moving many of, you know, the shareholder actions last year. I think it got a lot of attention when board members are being removed from Fortune companies. So I think even the CEO, going back to maybe the CEO doesn't have the heart for this, the CEO does have, you know, the commitment to make sure there's strong share performance and hopefully to engage with, you know, stakeholders that are having these conversations, whether it be even in his or her own boardroom or, you know, wherever they come from. So I don't think, I think this is really much more of a movement than is visible right now. And again, I think it's for offensive because people think it makes for good business, and defensive because I don't want my, you know, shareholders coming after me if I don't work.
Can I take it a step further? I couldn't agree more, but I think now everyone's an activist. I think your employees in your own company are activists.
Totally.
Everyone's watching now. So that's one of my things. Don't say it if you don't mean it, because you will be held accountable by shareholders, by employees, by constituents in the community. The activism is at a different level now. And people are being called out in ways that they've never been called out before, which makes, you're trying to please a lot of constituents. It makes the job harder. And that's why I go back to then having very clear metrics and setting clear goals allows you to tell a very consistent story to all of those constituents.
Yeah. The activism piece, I think, is something we feel at Just because of who's using our data and our rankings and so on. It's investors, consumers, policymakers, companies themselves. Jean, I just want to touch up very quickly. I know you spent a lot of time in the venture space.
Yeah.
Are you seeing the sort of the way venture investors invest in companies change is in the term sheets and the investment agreements? Is it sort of, we talk about executive comp, but is it finding its way into the relationship between venture investors and the companies?
Look, I think there are signs and glimmers of hope. If you look at what NASDAQ and Goldman and others have done, I think it's exciting, and it really tells companies who dream of IPOing, what they have to get together before they IPO. So they're thinking about it earlier in the process. But going back to this data point, the data is dire. Okay, it's dire. Less than 2% of venture capital went to women-led firms last year. Less than 1% to African-American-led firms last year. As Mellody said, this is 2021. Are you kidding me? And I think there's a great concern about it. I think there's all kinds of innovation being left on the sidelines because women see different opportunities. People of color see different opportunities for products and services and innovations that, frankly, the traditional coastal, startups aren't really thinking about. So I think it's an economic imperative to change this. We're investing a lot in, whether they be accelerators, incubators, straight up funds that are moving more capital that way. And we did see a lot of movement on money going to particularly Black owned funds last year, which is one of those glimmers of hope.
Thanks, Jean and Mellody. I know we have 8 minutes left. We have a couple questions people ready to ask, as well as a ton of questions in the queue. So here's what I'm going to try and do. I'm going to ask Rocky Howard to join us. She's a advisor to Just and had a question we wanted to make sure we got to. And then I'm going to try and summarize several of the questions and give you a big question. You can choose to answer it whichever way you want to go to finish us off. So Rocky, over to you.
Hi, Jean, Mellody. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you. I think you're both the very definition of special forces. Thank you for investing your time in conversations like today that will hopefully continue to pave the way for more of us to join the special forces team. I'm curious, so many companies' diversity initiatives are tied to a moment. In 2017, it was Me Too. Now we see 2020 and George Floyd. And as a chief diversity officer for a tech company, I'm already, and I get to interact with multiple companies, I'm already hearing terms like diversity fatigue rearing its ugly head. When there's only 7.5% of the Fortune 500 CEOs that are women, less than 1% that are Black, 85% of executives are white. Do you think the activism that you referred to earlier is enough to keep not only the conversation going, but more importantly, the progress going?
Mellody, take that one.
Rocky, I'm not sure. And the reason I have a lot of reticence here, I said last year, I don't want this to be a moment and then people move on, which is what we do in our society. And I see exactly what you see. I feel exactly what you feel. And I'm very, very concerned that it will be the summer that, diversity crested and then everything went back to the way it was. So I wish I had a better, clearer, more optimistic answer for you. The jury is out.
What she said.
I appreciate the truth, but let's stay in the fight. Thank you both.
Thanks, Rocky. And Lauren Tacho, who is a Just Gen advisory member, also has a question. So Lauren.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this incredible conversation. I have not been able to pull away from my screen here. My question is, what can we do to destigmatize working as a parent and make the business case for better childcare access, even if, you know, we're just colleagues, or in my case, a relatively junior colleague?
Yeah, I think that, you know, part of what people think about when they think about working parents are really thinking about working moms. And I think until we get to a place where it's recognized that in many homes, there's a mom and a dad, and that the employers of men who are parents kind of recognize that it's really not all on the women. And I think I think that has been laid bare in the last year, the disproportionate burden of working women who have children. By some accounts, it's as many as 3 to 5 hours more per day that they've had to put in for the, you know, sort of, I don't want to call it unpaid labor because it's truly labor of love. But nonetheless, it's still viewed as a women's role. And I think until that fundamentally changes, it's going to be really hard, I think, to destigmatize. But it really is on all of us. And I'm particularly talking to the men who are leaders and who are executives, and to make it clear that they too are parents, and to be a little more transparent about what all parents need, and that it's not exclusively a working mom's issue.
One of the things that I think that has helped me on this issue is actually becoming a mother. I think you have a different sensitivity. So I think more women who are mothers need to be in charge, because I think that they then can institutionalize again some of these things that can be very helpful. I think there are signals you can send to an organization. I think those signals are direct and indirect. So there could be everything from the flexibility and work and schedule. Those things are very, those are levers you can pull. But I think destigmatizing it comes from a perspective of vantage point that you send signals to the organization, big or small, what your belief and value system is. And so one of the things I've tried to do just very, very transparently is to let people know, oh, which I did this morning, I have a 7-year-old Everest. I have to take Everest to the eye doctor today. And it was 9 to 10. You know, just being very clear about that. I've got this eye doctor appointment. So then it's like, well, if Melody's going to the eye doctor with a 7-year-old, I don't have to be embarrassed to say that I'm doing this, that, or the other. So just making people feel safe in that way. But someone said something to me once that I thought was very important. And this is going to maybe sound like I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth, and I promise you I'm not. They said to me something once. They said, you know, I have parents that'll say to me, you know, well, I have to be at that soccer game. And this person said to me, sometimes that work output is actually more important than that soccer game. And you know, you should be able to also say that too, to a colleague, like, this is mission critical. I'd love you to go to every game, but that's not possible. And so we have to be able to be honest brokers. You know, the health of my child, there's nothing that is more important. And I'm sure many of the parents on the phone feel the same way on the Zoom, but there are nice to haves, and we can't get all the things that are nice to have in society. It just doesn't work that way. So being realistic about that at times is something that I think is very important. And I say that as a person who sits in the seat, knowing when some of those mission critical times have happened, where I have to say to someone, no, this is what I need you to do right now, because a lot of people, there's a lot at stake here for other people, not just you.
Thank you. Really thoughtful, and I know we could go on forever. I'm going to summarize a couple of the themes I'm seeing in the questions, ask for both of your just final reflections, and then hand it over to Martin to close, all in 90 seconds. So let me begin. There's a lot of questions about pipeline. How do we really ensure intersectionality, actual opportunity, the role of men, which I think is interesting and has come up a few times today. A lot of questions about board diversity in particular. questions about beyond diversity into, paid family leave, child care, good wages, the sort of full package of what it means to be a good job for women and workers of color. So a lot of things around beyond diversity into both equity as well as bigger job questions, a lot on pipeline, ensuring that we really are creating plenty of opportunity for people to grow, including at a board level. So with that, let me ask for final reflections, and again, just say thank you for such a rich conversation.
I'll go first because I think Melody should do a strong close here, as I know she can. I just think it's really important for any leader to ask who's not at the table. And by at the table, I mean in the boardroom and in the C-suite. And when I say who, it's look at your workforce and make sure that anyone in your workforce, when looking up into the organization and at leadership, sees someone that they say, okay, that feels like me. And, it isn't, again, for all the reasons we talked about before, it's not just right. That's going to be how you create that flywheel effect. When people see a leader that they can look up to, they then see themselves as leaders in the organization and believe in the potential for them to climb. And, I think it is a battle for talent out there. And if you want to keep your talent, I think it's just critical to make sure you have both a diverse and inclusive culture.
So I couldn't agree with you more. I think that these issues of all the things you talked about, all the needs and the wants of a workforce, there are trade-offs. Companies have to make them all the time. It can be excruciatingly hard. And so I think understanding that is very important. Leaders must prioritize. And I think when it comes to diversity and inclusion, they have to prioritize that is something that is important to them. What I ask people to do is to do a thought experiment. And I actually learned this from watching a John Grisham movie. I can't even remember which one it was, but there's Sam Jackson, he's on trial. I can't remember which one it was. And Matthew McConaughey is doing this closing argument, and he plays through this brutal thing that he's being accused of, a time to kill, someone is saying. And he goes to the end and he describes the whole scene. And he says, and the person was white. And the whole jury, everything, the whole argument, just suddenly, the visual that everyone had, you can just tell in the brilliance of the scene, is that they pictured a Black guy. It's like that was the visual that they had until he said they were white. So I do the exact same thing. And what I do to people, I did this in my TED Talk, I said, imagine that you walk into a boardroom, and I just literally make it any company, ExxonMobil, and every single person around the table is Black. You would literally say, what is up with this? How is this giant company, everyone's Black? I am asking people every time they walk into a room to put that lens on, so then they could see what is missing in the room. And so when you walk into a room where everyone is white, I can promise you, or everyone is a man, we see it as women and people of color. We are acutely aware of it. We need that same awareness from white men. And I say that with love, with heart, with imploring that lens is created. And to the extent that people are walking into rooms and see that, I think that we can start changing this conversation and really elevating this idea of what diversity and real inclusion look like. And it takes work. And inviting colleagues in your life to help you with that is something that I think is very, very big and bold. So I know that sounds pie in the sky, but it's actually just practical. It's just sort of walking into a room, what's missing? And if you did that every single time. I had a friend who ran a big national magazine and newspaper. He said the only time he stopped the presses was when they were doing the 150th anniversary of that city. He had two of his best reporters do a special pullout section. The day that the pullout section was supposed to run, they threw it on his desk. He started to open up. It was a majority minority city, and the special pullout section didn't have one person of color in it. He stopped the presses, and it led him to have a line that they used throughout that organization, again, embedding it in the DNA. He said he realized they were great reporters. It was just a limited point of view. So he started to ask the question, is everyone in the room? that became the tell or the way of saying what's missing. I told that story, and then CAA, Creative Artists Agency, put that sign in all of their conference rooms. Is everyone in the room? Just to remind them that they're limiting the outcomes by being monolithic.
Wow. Well, I've been on about 3,000 Zoom calls over the last 18 months, as I'm sure you have. And this is probably, this is phenomenal. This has just been wonderful. Thank you so much, both of you, Jean and Mellody, not just for this and for being just so strong and you know, just so candid, but also for everything that you do and you, I'm sure, inspire so many. So thank you. Sorry we ran over by a few minutes, but really appreciate it and can't wait to do it again in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.